What's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today's video is one that started with a comment on a previous video, and then I went down a rabbit hole. Kenji3110 suggested using game performance instead of game mode. Imperial El Nino 4670 joined in and added his benchmarks for control. The differences between the average, minimum, and max frame rates were negligible, but average frame rates don't always tell the full story. What exactly does each configuration actually do under the hood? Game performance works by switching your power profile to performance mode via Power Profiles daemon, which raises the CPU governor to performance and keeps your CPU boosting aggressively. It also switches any active SEX schedule to its gaming profile. So in layman's terms, game performance is running your CPU at full throttle at all times, even if it doesn't need it, so it's always ready. Game mode run works differently. It adjusts process niceness levels to give the game higher CPU scheduling priority and also switches the CPU governor to performance. The problem on CachyOS is that the ananicy-cpp service is already managing process niceness automatically. So when game mode run tries to do the same thing, the two services fight each other, which causes a conflict. I decided to find out which method is best, game mode or game performance, or neither. I ran proper benchmarks across two games, Cyberpunk 2077 and Red Dead Redemption 2, using 4 different configurations. No tweaks at all, game performance, game mode run with ananicy-cpp still running, and game mode run with ananicy-cpp disabled. I ran the benchmark with each setting 3 times and combined them all into a single dataset. Before we get into the numbers, if you find this kind of content useful, real benchmarks, real methodology, no sponsored bias, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel and means that I can keep doing deep dives like this one. First, let's talk about how I set this up, because methodology matters a lot when you're trying to draw conclusions from benchmark data. My computer has an Intel i7 12700K processor, 32 gigabytes of RAM, and an AMD RX 9070 XT. I ran all tests using the CachyOS Proton June 1st build version 3. Both Cyberpunk and Red Dead Redemption 2 were using FSR4 for upscaling. FSR4 was native in Cyberpunk, and Red Dead Redemption 2 had FSR4 enabled using Optiscaler. Graphics settings were consistent for both games across all tests. There were 4 configurations tested. Baseline, no game performance, no game mode run, and the ananicy-cpp service running normally. Game mode run active with ananicy-cpp still running, so the conflict scenario that the CachyOS wiki warns about. Game mode run with no ananicy-cpp, and game performance, which is CachyOS's recommended wrapper, with ananicy-cpp still running. I used MangoHud for all logging with a 100 millisecond sample interval. Each configuration was run 3 times, and the results were combined into a single dataset of roughly 2,000 samples for Cyberpunk and 4,000 for Red Dead 2. Combining runs rather than averaging them gives a more statistically robust picture than just comparing run averages. For Cyberpunk 2077, I used the built-in benchmark with no frame cap, VSync off, and variable refresh rate disabled on my monitor. For Red Dead 2, I captured specifically the St. Denis segment of the built-in benchmark. That's the densest urban area with the heaviest NPC simulation and draw call load, which makes it the most CPU-sensitive part of the test, and it's the most consistent. Let's start with Cyberpunk 2077. Across all 4 configurations, average frame rate was essentially 79 frames per second. Half a frame per second separates the lowest average from the highest. All 4 configurations perform identically in terms of average FPS with a range of half a frame per second. There's no distinguishable difference in frame rate. The 1% lows are also virtually identical at 68 frames per second. Again, expected range of variance across multiple runs. The 0.1% lows tell a different story. The base configuration and game mode with ananicy-cpp running and disabled have 0.1% lows at 64.2 and 65.5 frames per second. However, game performance is sitting at 49.4. I have a theory why that is, and I'll get to that in a minute. What's interesting is the CPU power data. Game performance drew 73.4 watts average CPU power in Cyberpunk compared to high 50s for the other configurations. That's up to 15 watts more power draw for zero measurable performance benefit in a GPU limited game. Obviously, the reason why game performance mode is drawing so much more power is because it maxes out the clock speed of the CPU. And I think that's why the 1% lows for game performance is so much lower than the other three configurations. I'm not hitting the max temp of my CPU, nor am I hitting the max power draw. There's no reason for my CPU to be throttling. So my theory is it has something to do with the CPU governor or scheduler. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in the follow-up video on that topic. My takeaway from testing Cyberpunk is if your game is GPU limited, it doesn't matter which configuration you use, but game performance is drawing more power for slightly lower performance. Red Dead Redemption 2 tells a completely different story, and this is where things get genuinely interesting. Red Dead 2's Rage engine does significantly more CPU work than Cyberpunk's Red engine. NPC simulation, pathfinding, draw call generation, especially in the Saint Denis segment with its dense crowds, puts real pressure on the CPU. The average CPU load at baseline was 43.8% versus 32.6% in Cyberpunk. And critically, GPU load was 95.9% rather than 99.8%, meaning the GPU occasionally had idle time waiting for CPU work. That's the window where CPU side tuning can actually matter. At baseline, average frame rate was 92.8 frames per second. All three tuned configurations beat that. Game mode run with ananicy-cpp at 98, game mode run without ananicy-cpp at 99, and game performance at 97.7 frames per second. There's clear evidence here that all three tuned configurations have an advantage over baseline. These results are closer to what I was expecting for Cyberpunk. Average frame time for base was 10.78 milliseconds. All three tuned configurations beat that. Game mode run with ananicy-cpp hit 10.2 milliseconds. Game mode run with ananicy-cpp hit 10.2 milliseconds. Game mode run without it hit 10.1, and game performance hit 10.24. That doesn't seem like much, but it translates to roughly 5 to 7 frames per second gains over the baseline across the board. The reason is clearly visible in the clock speed data. At baseline, the CPU averaged 3.9 gigahertz. It was sitting in a low power state and not boosting aggressively. All three tuned configurations pushed the CPU between 4.5 and 4.8 gigahertz. The CPU was being starved of boost clocks at baseline, and any of the three tools fixed that. I made a small mistake while benchmarking the first two base runs, and I didn't have the CPU wattage monitoring properly enabled in MangoHud. I did get one base benchmark monitored, and the CPU averaged 36 watts through the 2-minute run. Game mode run configurations jumped to around 52 watts, and game performance ran at 74 watts continuously, which makes sense because game performance uses the performance power profile to keep the CPU elevated at all times, even between frames. Now, here's where game performance mode gets complicated. Despite having the highest CPU clocks and the biggest average frames per second gain over baseline, it has the worst 0.1% lows of any configuration, 44.2 compared to 50.1 for game mode run, 44.2 compared to 50.1 for game mode run with ananicy-cpp. One finding that surprised me, game mode run with ananicy-cpp running was not measurably worse than without it in Red Dead 2. Both landed at roughly 98 to 99 frames per second average. So what does all of this actually mean for how you should set up CachyOS, or any distro for that matter, for gaming? First, the CachyOS Wiki's recommendation to use game performance is not valid. Game performance was nearly identical to the other configurations in all categories except significantly worse in 0.1% lows, had a much higher power draw, and higher clock speeds. It just wasn't as efficient as the other configurations. Second, whether any of these tools makes a difference depends entirely on whether your game is CPU limited or GPU limited. In Cyberpunk, at these settings, nothing moved the needle because the GPU was the wall. In Red Dead 2's Saint Denis, all three tuned configurations gained 5 to 7 frames per second over baseline because the CPU was a genuine bottleneck. Third, game mode with the ananicy-cpp conflict is a myth. Frame rates and power efficiency were nearly identical for both games. I don't think it's enough to justify worrying about the ananicy-cpp service not running, at least not on my system. My personal recommendation is to just use game mode and not worry about stopping ananicy-cpp first. The data shows it still outperforms baseline in CPU-sensitive games. The performance difference versus stopping the ananicy-cpp service is minimal in practice, and it's not worth the extra step every time you game. Game performance draws 40% more CPU power for a loss of 1.4 frames per second. That said, results will vary game by game. Highly CPU-intensive titles like City Skylines or Civilization, for example, games that stress the CPU continuously with simulation work, may respond better to game performance's approach of keeping the CPU in a sustained high power state. Test your own games and see, and let me know in the comments below what you found out. And that's it for this one. Next up, I'm planning to run the same benchmark suite on the Ryzen 7 1700X paired with an RTX 3080, a genuinely CPU-limited system, to see if the differences between configurations are even more pronounced when the CPU is the clear bottleneck. That should be the more dramatic version of this test. If you've got questions about the methodology or want to see a specific configuration tested, drop it in the comments. If you found this useful, the like button genuinely helps. And I'll see you in the next one.